She's going to tell us a little bit about a new history research project that she's been pursuing lately. Take it away, Carol.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the Tsimshian territory and that we are very privileged to be here, and that is sort of something that I just wanted to say first. And welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for coming. It's just so amazing to see all these people, most of whom I know, and those people that I don't know as well. That's really good. It makes me feel wonderful. There is a book, but this is not a book launch. I just want to make that clear. So I'll be talking about the research, but not about the book itself. And I wanted to also say that I feel quite humble about this because it's not really my story to tell. I'm not First Nations. I never worked at this hospital. I didn't live in Prince Rupert, but somehow this topic just got into my brain and I could not let it go. And the more people I talked to, it just seemed like for their sake, I could not let it go. So I just kept going little by little by little, and here it is. So I hope that you will find this research interesting. I've been working on it for about 5 years or more. I started out talking to various people, whoever I could find that would talk to me. And then I went to the archives in Prince Rupert and in Victoria and in Ottawa and got just tons of information. And then the next challenge was, what am I going to do with it? How will I ever make sense of it all? So the PowerPoint that I have here hopefully will help to put some pattern to it and give you some background to this institution that was operating for 25 years in Northwest BC and touched the lives of hundreds and hundreds of people. When I first started, when I first thought about starting on this, the very first person I talked to was Mildred Roberts, who many of you know. And I guess it's somewhere in my mind I was thinking that she would have something to say like, oh yes, it was a terrible place, and we just it's one of those really bad legacies. But what she said was, it was a place for people to recover, to get help, and to be healed. So then I realized it was going to be more complex than I had originally thought. So, without further ado, I will start with the PowerPoint. Now, I didn't explain, in case people don't know where Miller Bay was, it was 7 miles, in those days miles, outside of Prince Rupert. When you're going to Prince Rupert and you cross the bridge to go onto Cane Island, you sort of go up a little hill, and then there is a turning lane still there. And if you followed the turning lane, you'd find a driveway and some posts, yellow posts there. And that is the entrance to Miller Bay Hospital. So if you walk down, obviously you can't drive anymore, you walk down and you can find still the smokestack standing there and part of the building, part of one of the buildings. So this hospital was originally, well, maybe I better start the PowerPoint. Here's the sign that used to be on the, which button do I push for? Sorry. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Did I mention that I'm technologically challenged?
So this guy right here.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, okay. So, and I won't try to put a little red dot on it. There's a sign there that used to be by the side of the road just to say that was Miller Bay Hospital. And although it says Miller Bay Indian Hospital up there, that was its official name, but the original director decided that they wouldn't put the name Indian on because in BC that wasn't a term that he felt was being used very much. And so it just says Indian Hospital. It just says Miller Bay Hospital. And that's a picture of it as it was from out in the water in about I think that was in the 60s that picture was taken. It was built by the RCAF, the Air Force, during World War II. For those of you that are here, there is a plan, an original plan for the building that was dated 1944, and that was the year that it was built. But they built it because they thought there would be a lot of fighting in the Aleutians with Japan, and that never materialized. So the hospital was never used for that purpose. But it was there, and apparently there were guards, armed guards, in front of it for a couple of years until the war was over. After the war was over, people were looking for something for First Nations people because of TB, and tuberculosis was a big problem at that time. It had been around. There is some evidence, I guess, some archaeological evidence that it was around even before European contact. But after, with colonization, the conditions that are good for TB were increased dramatically. People were moved out of their traditional territories. They were put into, they often had substandard housing and not adequate food. And so these are all conditions that the tuberculosis germ loves. And so they were very susceptible to it. Now this is a bit of a busy slide, but on the one side, I've got the contrast between the treatment of TB with the non-Aboriginal and the Aboriginal population, in BC particularly. So in BC, we had Tranquille Sanatorium that was opened in 1906, which was 40 years before Miller Bay. And it closed in 1958, which was another 13 years before Miller Bay actually closed. By 1939, the government was congratulating itself on the success that TB treatment had reached, and that treatment was under control, and that it was, really big success of the healthcare system. And they had a lot of support from various national organizations like the Junior Red Cross and the Canadian TB Association. They got a lot of funding and a lot of support. In contrast, there was nothing equivalent for Aboriginal people until the three hospitals opened in BC. And in 1939, the death rate was 5 to 10 times at least, I've seen higher stats too, than for non-First Nations people. And the funding for their treatment was from the federal government, from Indian Affairs. And in fact, in the late 30s, there was a directive that no patients with chronic illness, which TB was really, would be admitted, or First Nations people would be admitted to a public hospital. So it was all very, very strange. So this Dr. Galbraith was a doctor in Bella Coola. And this story of old Cahoose, some of you may have heard this. This was his name in English. I don't know what his real name was, but he came from a remote village near Anaheim Lake on the Algacho Reserve. And he came all the way to Bella Coola for help because he was really sick. So when he got there, Dr. Galbraith examined him and found that he had advanced tuberculosis and that he really needed sanitarian care, which at that time really only involved bed rest and extra nutrition and a few other things that they could do because there were no drugs for it yet. So anyway, he contacted Tranquille And they said, no, we can't take him because he's Indian. And because there were these two healthcare systems in place, and they apparently couldn't, they couldn't be crossed, the lines couldn't be crossed. So Dr. Galbraith sent him home and said, the important thing is that you keep yourself isolated from your family so that you don't spread it to them. And TB can be extremely contagious, especially when it's in an advanced state. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't have stopped there. So about 3 years later, Dr. Galbraith was traveling in that region, and he went to the El Gacho Reserve and found old Cahoose in a tent outside his home where he'd lived for the last 3 years. And he was just skin and bones. He was on his last legs. And he tried so hard not to spread his disease, but he'd had no treatment and he was dying. And in fact, he had still infected a couple of children in the family because, somebody had to bring him his food and he had to have some contact with them. So Dr. Galbraith was very upset about this. He took a picture of him in the state and he sent it to all the levels of government and said, something must be done about this. And so that was really how BC got its first Indian hospital. I'm going to use that term because that's what they were called. And that was at Coquilitza, which had been a residential school. It had had a fire and then it was sort of rebuilt as a hospital. And then a couple of years later, Miller Bay was opened. So Miller Bay was in, Coquilitza was in 1941, Miller Bay 46, and Nanaimo was the same year. So there were 3 of them in BC. This picture was in a photo album that somebody lent me. It was the most remarkable photo album. It was must have been from the early days of Miller Bay, and it was pictures of patients, and it was just amazing. Anyway, this one picture, it's not labeled, but it has to be from the opening day, which was September the 16th, 1946. Because if you look really closely, there's a ribbon there, and you can't really see it, I guess, but they must have been going to cut it. There's a band that was playing, and the people are dressed in the sort of fashions of the 40s. And if you look really carefully in the foreground, on the right-hand side, there's a little boy leaning out the window watching, and he must have been one of the earliest patients. This was a picture of sort of how the hospital was laid out. It was all in, it had been built for military purposes. It really wasn't built for women and children at all. So they had to do some adjusting. At the top is the A ward, which was for babies and toddlers. Then the next 2 were women and girls. And in the center is the administration offices, and the kitchen and the cafeteria was in there too, or dining room. And then there were the men and boys. And finally, at the bottom, there was an operating room and x-ray and different things like that. There was even a few rooms for matrons, which would, the head nurse was called a matron. So when people, I'm focusing on TB, later on, lots of other people with lots of other conditions were admitted to the hospital. And also, in the beginning, another big reason for having the hospital was venereal disease, because there were troops stationed in Prince Rupert, and their main concern, the health authorities' main concern, was that these soldiers would be infected, and they were blaming the First Nations women, which is quite backwards because obviously somebody infected them in the first place. So they had a secure area at the hospital apparently, where they would keep people that didn't want to stay. So anyway, that was in the beginning. It changed as time went by. So before TB drugs, which came the end of the 40s, early 50s, they could only offer bed rest, very strict bed rest. You could be lying in bed all day for maybe months, and then as your condition improved, you would maybe be allowed up a few hours a day, and then, gradually, very gradually. Lung collapse or pneumothorax was a procedure they did quite a bit, because the theory was that if you could rest the lung, that it would be able to heal itself. So they did this very painful procedure that would happen every couple of weeks for up to 5 years. It wasn't just a one-time thing. So that was a major strategy that was really all they had. And then when people had very advanced disease, they might have to have major chest surgery, which can involve as far as having a whole lung removed, or maybe just a few ribs, which would cause the lung to collapse and rest. For children, they would often get a different form of TB, which could be in the bones or in the glands. And TB can strike any part of the body, actually. But a lot of children would have these bone TB cases, and they would have to have casts on, and sometimes even body casts, because they had to be, the theory was that they had to be strictly resting and not, that would help the disease to get better. So after the drugs appeared, that was a dramatic change, because they found that often, things would clear up just dramatically within a few weeks, even, that things would improve. So they didn't need so much rest. They didn't need such a long hospitalization. And so it was really good until they realized that the drugs could become, or the bacteria could become resistant to the drugs. And so then they had to, not experiment, but they had to, as a medical profession, they started using combinations of drugs to try and combat it, which is what, to this day, is what they have to do. Because there's even more drug resistance now, as we know. So another part of the hospital that I didn't know about or didn't think about at first was that there was a day school there. And because there were so many children, and actually the ages of the patients were very young as a whole. So they did have an Indian day school. And at first they were mostly all in bed. So the teacher had to go to the bedside and teach what she could, and fit it in between all the rest periods, because there was a lot of rest periods. Later on, quite a few years later, they finally did get a classroom for those who could be up. There was occupational therapy right from the start. That was for adults as well as children, to keep, give them something to do, because it was pretty boring. There wasn't even TV or anything like that in those days. Music was a big thing, and I've heard of quite a few people who learned to play the guitar or the harmonica there. There was a choir of children. It wasn't, unlike with the residential schools, the object wasn't to assimilate. The object wasn't to assimilate, but obviously it happened because, most of the staff were English speaking and European culture. So through the schooling, that did happen, of course. For adults, there was the chance to learn to read for some people if they didn't already know, or to continue their schooling. And later on, but in the 60s, the federal government had an on-the-job training program for patients who were getting better that could learn skills for working in the hospital. It was noted in a couple of places that I read that this didn't really extend to professional type training. It was pretty basic training, like ward aides and maybe up to LPNs, which, practical nurses. But anyway, it was very basic, but it was there. this is just a picture of what you see now when you go there. This was part of the laundry and powerhouse. And it wasn't built till 1948, I don't think, but it's the only part that's left. And just in the background is part of the smokestack. One of the things that happened in the 50s was that they had what they called irregular discharges, and a lot of people leaving without permission, without, the doctor's approval. And they had a higher rate at Miller Bay than at either of the other two hospitals, and they didn't really know why. Also, it was more women than men tended to leave, and the younger people below the age of 35. So at first, they used some, they tried to use persuasion first, and then they would go to what they called coercion. They actually used the word coercion in the records, which I was surprised, and police methods. So coercion included denying the family payments like social assistance and things like that, like taking away things. So what I should have said about that too was they did do a big survey that they surveyed both patients and staff and to find out just what the problems were, and out of that survey came a lot of recommendations, including how they would hire people, like that people needed to have an accepting kind of attitude before they could work there. And whether that always translated, I don't know, but they did, it seemed like they made a lot of effort to try and make this a better, and apparently it did. Also during the 50s, there was quite a lot of poor morale among the patients and the staff. And so they did another survey of the women's ward, because they were also the ones that were leaving in greatest numbers. And that led to some nurses being removed from the ward because they were so, a lot of patients identified them as being very abrasive and mean. They developed a patient's council so the patients could have a say in things. Now that sort of backfired on them, on the administration, because the patient's council grew very confident, and they started to make recommendations about how the hospital should be run, and of course the administration didn't want that, so, there was a newspaper that the patients produced themselves. Around this time, Dr. Fiddes, who he had been there earlier, but he took over as medical director in about the mid-50s, and he did a lot of changes that seemed to have been very positive. Like, he got rid of the detention cells that had been there, as I mentioned, about people being kept. He also changed a policy where new babies, if they happened to be born there, would be removed from their mothers right away because of fear of contagion. But he had done some research and found that they could safely be kept together under certain circumstances, and so he changed that policy and improved things that way. Just generally the atmosphere apparently improved quite a bit. And this, when we went up there, we discovered there's still at least one old bed frame lying there in the bush. So working at Miller Bay, I talked to a lot of people who worked there, as well as some, as whoever I could find. So they had accommodation there right from the start. The RCAF had built one building that was used for residents, for staff, and then after that they built some of these like duplexes and individual houses. There was quite a few buildings that were there, and a lot of people, this lady was not one of them, but a lot of people who had been patients did stay on and work in the hospital. She came herself, like she came as a young woman and got training and became a practical nurse. So there were some opportunities. There were, if any of you read the book Stony Creek Woman, She talks about her daughter, or at least the person who's being talked about in the book, talks about her daughter who went to Miller Bay to work and then was infected herself and spent many years and eventually died of TB. So it could be risky. It was a risky thing sometimes, and that's probably why they often had so much trouble recruiting, especially nurses. For the staff, there was a lot of discontent and nurses, well, not just nurses, but staff who complained that there was nothing to do and that was too far away from everything. And so there at the Seal Cove Air Force Base in Prince Rupert, there was a recreation hall all built. So what they did was they dismantled it, moved it to Miller Bay and put it up again. So they had a recreation hall for many years, and a lot of people mentioned it who'd worked there as somewhere that they really enjoyed going. They had dances there as well as badminton and basketball and stuff. There was a bus service between Port Edward and Prince Rupert, and they would stop at Miller Bay and pick people up and bring them back. And there were a lot of families of the staff who lived right there. So it was like a real little community. And the children would take the bus to Prince Rupert to go to school. As time went on, they tried to keep it open. They tried to get, they eventually opened it up to more than just First Nation people. Anybody, apparently, other people were patients there as well, and less TB because there just was less and less. By the late 1960s, it became an extended care unit or facility, and the school disappeared because there just weren't the children anymore. And then finally, all the patients were transferred into Prince Rupert or other places, and it closed in September 1971. So it was exactly 25 years later after it had opened. And after that time, it has a number of identities. It was a fish farm, a petting zoo, a residence for the workers that were working on the Ridley Island terminal. Then there was a fire, which they kind of thought might have been arson, where most of the buildings were demolished. And most recently, it was a paintball site. But now it appears that nothing is happening there. It's just growing and growing over, just like one of those Victorian novels where things just disappear into the vines and bushes. So there's a picture of as it was then, and there's that smokestack. You can see it in the left-hand picture. And it's still standing, very sort of symbolic or iconic or something. So I have written down a few references, books that if anybody is interested in following up to learn more. These ones are about healthcare for First Nations people and sort of health issues that way. And then these ones are specifically on the Indian hospitals. The top one was written in 2013, and it concentrates on Charles Camsell in Alberta and Nanaimo. The second one was just published last year and looks at the whole of across Canada. And then Gary Geddes has just published one which also looks across Canada. So then mine is just looking specifically at Miller Bay, and as kind of a little microscopic look at one hospital. So I think that's all that I have to say. But if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Was coercion used to keep people from leaving? Is that what that was for?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it was, yeah. Yeah, hi, Al.
Hi. Thanks for this. There's been some recent news over the last few years of an increase in tuberculosis again in the region, and certainly globally, particularly with respect to antibiotic resistant strains and so on. Can you comment on that at all?
Just that, yes, that it's not, it hasn't gone away. TB is still a problem, and especially in third world countries, and certainly in Canada, it's people who live in more in poverty, like, or who have any kind of what we call the social determinants of health. If the right conditions are there for TB to develop, then they certainly do have a higher incidence. Yeah, and then the drug resistance is a complication. So, yeah.
Carol, what were the peak numbers of patients and staff at the facility?
180 was sort of the highest number that I ever saw. So in the scale of the other hospitals, it was a smaller one actually, but.
And how many staff, doctors and nurses, would look after them?
Sometimes there were only 2 or 3 doctors, and I'm not sure, I never did see the actual number of nurses, but yeah, they had trouble recruiting doctors as well, so often they had people coming from overseas, like it was post-war, so you had a lot of refugees coming from Europe, and some of them were doctors, and so they may not have had their Canadian papers yet, but they were, they were hired to work. And yeah, and some nurses were like that too. They had to, they had to write another exam or something, but they hadn't quite done it yet. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Carol, can you just frame where the catchment area?
Sure.
How big of an area did Miller Bay actually serve?
Yeah, well, it was as far south, at least, as Bella Coola, and at least as far east as Vanderhoof, and then north probably, I don't know, I think Fort Ware, if you know where that is, and yeah, Dease Lake, the Talton area, yeah. Yeah, so it was quite a huge area, and it may have gone farther east as well, because if they didn't go to Miller Bay, they would have to go to Cocolitza. So it would depend on, how easy it was to get to either place from where you lived.
Well, and how were they diagnosed? Like they just show up at Miller Bay? Or?
Good question. Okay. Good question. I forgot to put that on there. Well, they had a lot of X-ray campaigns, sort of. Both they had people could come to Miller Bay and get their X-ray, which they did in large numbers because people were worried about it, so they did it. But also they had X-ray teams going out to the various villages, and they would do X-rays there and find people. And I know that looking at the Arctic, which was a different story altogether, but there they used to bring people onto the ship to have their X-rays, and then if they were found to have or suspected of having TB, they were just taken. Like they didn't even have time to go home and pack a suitcase or say goodbye to anybody. It was so there's a lot of very very bad history around that sort of thing. Now, from what I could see about Miller Bay, I don't know if that kind of thing happened. I don't think it could have been as dramatic because they didn't have to go on a boat, so they surely would have had time to make some preparation. But I know that was one of the factors for young mothers was leaving their children behind and not feeling secure about how they were being looked after and stuff.
I just wanted to add, my grandma did say they were taken and they didn't have any notice.
Is that right?
Well, my grandma died in the early 80s.
Oh, yeah.
I remember her telling us she was scared of TB because people just disappeared after they had
Right.
the doctor tell them they had TB.
Yeah.
It was when she was young.
Yeah, and I could imagine that happening because there was such a, they had, I guess they had this sort of missionary feeling almost that, okay, we're going to fix this and maybe not thinking about the others.
Yeah. Skeptical, I think they were guinea pigs.
Yeah, there is a lot of of concern about that, and that's one thing that I felt when I wrote the book. I never got any impression of that from any of the records that I read. I felt that the people that were, the doctors that were working, the main ones, who knows about the others, but they seemed to be very dedicated to it, very concerned, and if it looked like experimentation, it was only because nobody knew what to do, you know.
Well, it's really, I think.
Pardon me?
To me, just because I'm in the field, it feels like we kind of know where we're going with things, but I think when people don't understand what's happening and what their diagnosis fully is, because
That's right.
like you said, the culture we live in now is much different than the culture I came from
Yeah,
historically.
right.
Because everything is foreign and these people are just showing up and taking it away.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
sorry to take away from your.
No, that's
time.
really good. Yeah, because, yeah, I think that people often, there probably wasn't enough communication either to explain and make sure that people understood what was happening. Oh, yes.
Carol, was there a cemetery?
Not at Miller Bay,
Not-
no.
So when if people passed away, they went back to their villages?
They did, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Oh,
It's intriguing about the patient council and
Right.
the newspaper.
mhm.
Were you able to find a fair amount of information about that at all? Because that shows that the patients who were there were really concerned in a way about their rights
Mhm.
and what they wanted to see done. Did you find any information? Like you said, how the staff didn't like what they were doing. Do you have any examples?
Well, just there was this one quote that, well, the patients are beginning to think that they can direct things, you know, and certainly they can't tell us how to run the hospital, like, you know, but it was, mostly they were just giving feedback about things like the meals that were really boring and and then different activities, like the women didn't get to exercise like the men did. Men got to go outside for walks, but the women didn't at that point. And
Did you find any examples of the actual newspapers?
no, I tried, but I didn't find anything. I don't know.
That would be really.
It would be really interesting, yeah. Mhm.
Did you afterward, did the patients keep in contact with each other? Like, did it sort of create a network or anything like that?
I don't know. I never heard any evidence about that. Maybe somebody else knows that. I don't know. Hmm?
Were you able to interview any survivors?
Yes, a few, but I found that my conclusion was that it is a very emotional thing, and that people weren't. I mean, they didn't necessarily know me, and they didn't feel comfortable about talking to me about it. So I had far fewer actual patients to talk to than other people, unfortunately. But I did find, as much as I could of what people had said in the past, So.
Were there any records or anything that kind of gave an idea, like how many people were coming from where? Like,
Yes. Yeah, there was, there were a bunch of things, but they were just from the 40s. That's the only part that I got. But there were people, they had listed their place of origin, and they came sort of from all over. I don't think there was any one place that there was more of, but yeah. But I did hear from somebody from the Vanderhoof area who said that there's practically nobody in her village who wasn't there, or elders who hadn't been there. So,
I've got another numbers question for you. When did the buildings actually burn down?
I think it was 1984 or something.
Okay.
Or no, maybe it was after that. I don't remember exactly. It was. Anybody know?
Keith does.
Oh,
Before that,
it was before that?
yeah, because it was industrial camping there in 1982, which came to Mid-Island Developments.
Okay, so it was somewhere in the early 80s or before that, yeah.
Carol, I have a question. Where did all the medical records go?
They, guess they went to Ottawa.
Ottawa? So
Mhm.
they're probably still there, archived work of fish.
Yeah,
To
yeah.
look up.
Yeah, I was able to get, like with all the names taken out, I didn't want any names, and they, you know. But they gave, I got charts of, not charts, but like tables with people listed, and it talked about, like gave their ages and whether they were male or female, and sort of what kind of surgery they were getting or that kind of stuff. So, yeah, there's quite a few pages of that.
At the time before medication, because that changed the whole tuberculosis picture, if you maybe spent 5 years, would it be conceivable? Would you spend 5 years in Miller Bay?
Well, you
Or
shouldn't.
would that be a long?
Well, that would be really long. Like, you
Yeah.
shouldn't have to. I've heard there's just reports, you know, that of people that did still spend many years there, and I don't know, you know, what their specific story was, or, you know.
Mhm. Or before the medication came on the scene, you'd spend 3-4 years, whatever.
Yeah, or
and
more,
then go
yeah.
back to the village. And could you get reinfected? Or is it
You could, yeah, yeah.
So you
Yeah.
might come back as a repeat.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or because you hadn't been treated with drugs, because they didn't have them,
Right, right.
it might reactivate, yeah. So, yeah, there was people even in the 40s who'd been in some kind of hospital since they were like 3 years old, and now they were 17 or something like that. They spent their whole childhood, some of them, yeah.
Just, I do have a few names of people who were, and their voices of when they were kids from the CBC radio archives, which
Oh,
I've
yeah.
been researching too. And I think you listened to some of the programs.
I listened to yeah.
But for the children who were diagnosed, treated, and then were able to leave, do you think that they would have gone on to other institutional residential school situation,
Well-
or back home?
Well, I have one definite example. A man phoned me and told me about when he was there when he was 7, and it was his first time away from home. And at the end of the year, he spent a year there, and then when he thought he was going home, he was sent to residential school instead. Yeah. So so I'm sure he wasn't the only one. But yeah, and the residential schools, I just heard sort of anecdotally, but on the radio, and I didn't get any of the particulars to reference it, but that in some cases the residential schools didn't send a sick child to the hospital because they didn't want them to, they didn't want to have them be somewhere else and lose the influence of that particular church. So yeah, it's one of those things.
Well, if there are no more questions, why don't you join me in thanking Carol for her presentation today. We have a small gift for your next visit to Prince Rupert.
Well, thank you so much. I really, after all these years, I've been so absorbed with this. It's really, it really feels, I can't even describe how it feels to be able to share some of that.
Are you actually doing a book launch here in Terrace? I see you're
I
doing
will
one
be.
in Prince Rupert.
Yeah, I will be after the one in Rupert, but I don't know the date yet. Yeah. So, thank you.